The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the bustling streets of a lively urban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where life never seemed to slow down. Cars honked, streetlights flickered on, and people hurried along sidewalks with their own worries and plans. Among them was Tanya Johnson, a hard-working single mother who always put others before herself. She worked long hours at the local hospital as a nurse, caring for patients day and night. But tonight, her only focus was getting home to her two kids. Tanya clutched a bag of groceries tightly in one hand while balancing her phone in the other, checking messages from her son about his school project. Her mind was racing with thoughts about dinner, laundry, and everything else waiting for her back at her small apartment. As she crossed the street, lost in her thoughts, something unexpected happened. A slight bump against a parked police cruiser caught her attention. The sound was faint, almost unnoticeable, but it made her stop dead in her tracks. She looked down at the car and saw a tiny scratch near the rear bumper. Her heart sank. "Oh no," she muttered under her breath, immediately feeling guilty even though she knew it wasn't entirely her fault. The uneven pavement had caused her to misstep slightly, leading to the accident. Still, Tanya didn't hesitate. She glanced around, hoping no one would think she was trying to run away, and then walked over to inspect the damage more closely. Just as she leaned down to get a better look, the driver's door of the police car swung open. Out stepped Officer Mark Reynolds, a man whose reputation preceded him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that often came off as arrogance. Reynolds had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, and while some praised his dedication to keeping the streets safe, many residents whispered about his short temper and questionable behavior. People avoided crossing paths with him whenever possible. Reynolds glared at Tanya, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. Tanya straightened up quickly, holding up her hands in apology. "I'm so sorry," she said earnestly, her voice calm despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I didn't mean to hit your car. It was an accident. I'll pay for the repair if there's any damage." But Reynolds wasn't interested in hearing apologies or solutions. His jaw tightened, and his gaze swept over her dismissively. "You people are always causing trouble," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. Tanya froze, unsure whether she'd heard him correctly. Did he really just say that? Before she could respond, his tone grew louder and angrier. "Do you even know how much these cars cost? Or do you not care because you think someone else will clean up your mess?" Tanya blinked, taken aback by his sudden hostility. She hadn't expected kindness, but this level of aggression felt completely unwarranted. Trying to stay composed, she spoke softly but firmly. "Sir, I already apologized. There's no need to be rude. I'll take responsibility for what happened." Her words only seemed to fuel his anger. Reynolds stepped closer, invading her personal space. His towering frame loomed over her, making her feel small and vulnerable. For a moment, Tanya wondered if anyone nearby would step in to help if things got worse. But the street was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. Little did she know, this encounter was about to take a turn that neither of them could have anticipated. Tanya's heart raced as she stood there, her mind scrambling to figure out how to defuse the situation. She could feel the weight of Reynolds' glare pressing down on her, and the grocery bag in her hand suddenly felt heavier than before. Her instincts told her to stay calm, but every fiber of her being was screaming that something wasn't right. This wasn't just about a scratch on a car anymore. It had escalated into something far more personal and dangerous. "I'm telling you, I'll pay for it," Tanya repeated, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I don't want any trouble." She took a small step back, hoping to create some distance between herself and the officer. But Reynolds didn't budge. Instead, he leaned in closer, his face twisted with anger. "You think this is about money?" he snapped, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "People like you never take responsibility unless they're forced to. You probably don't even have a job, do you?" The comment stung, not because it was true, but because it was so wildly off base. Tanya worked tirelessly to provide for her family, often sacrificing her own needs to make ends meet. The accusation felt like a slap in the face, and for a moment she considered walking away, just leaving the groceries on the ground and heading home. But then she remembered her kids. They deserved better than a mother who ran from conflict without standing up for herself. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and looked him in the eye. "Sir, I'm a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital," she said firmly, her voice rising slightly. "I work 12-hour shifts taking care of people who are sick or hurt. I don't deserve to be spoken to like this." Her words seemed to enrage him further. Reynolds clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white, as he glared at her. "Don't talk back to me," he growled, pointing a finger inches from her face. "You don't get to tell me what you deserve." Before Tanya could respond, things spiraled out of control. Without warning, Reynolds grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her toward him. The grocery bag slipped from her grasp, spilling its contents onto the pavement. Apples rolled across the street. A carton of eggs cracked open, and a loaf of bread lay flattened under the weight of the chaos. Tanya gasped, struggling to pull away, but his grip was ironclad. "Let go of me," she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "You're hurting me." But Reynolds didn't listen. With a sudden burst of force, he shoved her backward, sending her stumbling onto the hard asphalt. Pain shot through her elbows and knees as she hit the ground, and for a moment, all she could do was stare up at him in disbelief. How could this be happening? She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd apologized, offered to fix the problem, and tried to stay respectful throughout. Yet here she was, lying on the cold pavement while a man sworn to protect and serve towered over her like a predator. And then came the final blow. As Tanya struggled to sit up, clutching her side, Reynolds raised his foot and kicked her hard in the ribs. The impact knocked the wind out of her, leaving her gasping for air. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the physical pain, but from the sheer injustice of it all. She curled into a ball, trying to shield herself as voices around her began to rise. "What are you doing? Stop that!" Someone yelled from across the street. "Are you serious right now?" Another voice chimed in, louder this time. Reynolds froze mid-motion, finally realizing that they weren't alone. A small crowd had begun to gather, neighbors peering out of windows, passers-by stopping in their tracks, and one young man filming the entire scene on his phone. For a split second, guilt flickered across Reynolds' face, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. He straightened up, brushing off his uniform as if nothing had happened, and glanced around at the growing audience. "This doesn't concern any of you," he barked, his voice laced with authority. "Mind your own business." But it was too late. The damage was done, and the witnesses weren't going anywhere. One elderly woman stepped forward, shaking her head in disgust. "We saw everything," she said firmly. "And trust me, this isn't over." As the tension mounted, Tanya slowly pushed herself to her feet, wincing with every movement. Her body ached, and her pride was bruised, but she refused to let Reynolds see her cry. She locked eyes with him, her expression a mix of pain and determination. Little did either of them know, karma was about to step in, and it wouldn't wait long to deliver its verdict. As Tanya struggled to her feet, the scene around her transformed into something out of a movie. The small group of onlookers had grown into a crowd, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. Some people stood frozen, unable to process what they'd just witnessed, while others whispered furiously among themselves. Among the bystanders was Marcus, a young man in his early 20s who lived just a few blocks away. He had been walking home from his part-time job at the corner store when he noticed the commotion. Marcus wasn't the type to get involved in conflicts. He preferred to stay under the radar. But something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just that an officer had crossed a line. It was the raw injustice of it all. As he watched Reynolds kick Tanya, His stomach churned with disgust. Without thinking twice, he pulled out his phone and began recording. His hands trembled slightly as he zoomed in on the scene, capturing every detail. Tanya crumpled on the ground, Reynolds towering over her, and the scattered groceries that told a story of interrupted normalcy. "This is insane," Marcus muttered under his breath as he kept the camera rolling. He quickly opened a social media app and started a live stream, knowing that the world needed to see what was happening right here, right now. Within seconds, viewers began flooding in, first dozens, then hundreds. Comments poured in faster than Marcus could read them. "What is wrong with this cop? Is this real life? Someone help her." The virtual audience was as outraged as the people standing on the street. Meanwhile, Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, emerged from her porch across the street. She leaned heavily on her cane, her face etched with concern. Though she moved slowly, there was fire in her eyes as she approached the scene. "Young lady, are you okay?" she asked Tanya gently, extending a hand to help her up. Tanya nodded weakly, still trying to catch her breath. Mrs. Alvarez turned her attention to Reynolds, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Officer, I've seen enough cruelty in my lifetime to know when someone is abusing their power. This isn't how you treat anyone, let alone a hard-working woman like her." Her words carried weight, not just because of her age, but because everyone in the neighborhood respected her. She was the kind of person who always spoke her mind, even if it meant standing alone. Reynolds glared at her, clearly irritated by the growing resistance. "Ma'am, I suggest you stay out of this," he said through gritted teeth. "This is a police matter." "A police matter?" Mrs. Alvarez shot back, her voice rising. "You call beating an innocent woman a police matter? If this is how you handle your job, maybe you shouldn't be wearing that badge." The tension in the air was palpable. More neighbors joined the crowd, some offering comfort to Tanya, others confronting Reynolds directly. A teenage girl handed Tanya a tissue, while a middle-aged man picked up the spilled groceries and placed them back in the torn bag. Each gesture, no matter how small, sent a clear message. Tanya wasn't alone. The community had her back. But the situation was far from resolved. Reynolds looked around, realizing that the tide was turning against him. His confident demeanor began to crack, replaced by a flicker of unease. For the first time, he seemed aware that his actions might have consequences beyond this moment. Still, he refused to back down completely. Instead, he barked orders at the crowd, telling them to disperse and warning them not to interfere with law enforcement. It was then that a new sound pierced the chaos. A loud screech of tires echoed down the street. Everyone turned their heads toward the source, including Reynolds. A delivery truck was barreling around the corner, its driver distracted by a navigation app. The vehicle swerved dangerously close to the curb, heading straight for Reynolds' patrol car. Time seemed to slow as the massive truck collided with the cruiser, sending a deafening crash rippling through the night. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the blaring alarm of the damaged police car filled the air. For a split second, the crowd fell silent, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Then murmurs erupted once again. "Did you see that? That's karma right there. Serves him right." Tanya, still leaning on Mrs. Alvarez for support, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of irony wash over her. Just moments ago, she had been the victim of unchecked aggression. Now, fate itself seemed to be stepping in to balance the scales. But the story was far from over, and neither Tanya nor Reynolds knew what would come next. The deafening crash of the delivery truck slamming into Reynolds' patrol car echoed like a thunderclap, jolting everyone on the scene. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Dust and shards of broken glass hung in the air, and the wail of the car alarm pierced through the night, adding an eerie soundtrack to the chaos. The crowd collectively gasped, their eyes wide with shock, as they took in the sight of the mangled cruiser. Its front end was completely crushed, the hood crumpled like paper, and steam hissed from under the twisted metal. Reynolds stumbled backward, his face pale and his mouth agape. He had been standing just a few feet away from his car when the collision occurred, narrowly avoiding being caught in the impact himself. A piece of debris grazed his arm, leaving a small cut that began to bleed, but otherwise he was physically unharmed. Still, the near miss left him visibly shaken. His bravado from moments earlier had vanished, replaced by a mix of confusion and panic. "What the?" he stammered, staring at the wreckage in disbelief. "What just happened?" The driver of the delivery truck, a harried-looking man in his 30s, jumped out of the vehicle, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the door. "I'm so sorry," he exclaimed, his voice frantic. "I didn't see it. I swear, I didn't see it." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly overwhelmed. "I was looking at my GPS, and I didn't realize I was drifting. Oh man, I can't believe this." The crowd murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged knowing glances. Marcus lowered his phone for a moment, his live stream capturing not only the aftermath of the crash, but also the reactions of those around him. In the chat, viewers were already drawing parallels between Reynolds' earlier actions and the sudden turn of events. "Karma's fast tonight," one comment read. Another added, "Guess the universe doesn't like bullies." Tanya leaned against Mrs. Alvarez, her body still aching from the assault, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of irony wash over her. She wasn't the type to take pleasure in someone else's misfortune, but it was hard to ignore the symbolism of what had just unfolded. 1 minute, Reynolds had been the embodiment of unchecked power, lashing out without consequences. The next, his prized possession, the symbol of his authority, was reduced to a heap of twisted metal. It was almost poetic. As the initial shock wore off, Reynolds began pacing back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. He pulled out his radio to call for backup, but his hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 24, he barked, his voice strained. "I need assistance at Lincoln and 5th. There's been an accident involving my vehicle." He paused, glancing nervously at the growing crowd before lowering his voice. "And there's a situation with a civilian. Send units ASAP." While Reynolds tried to regain control of the situation, the crowd continued to swell. More neighbors poured out of their homes, drawn by the noise and commotion. Some brought chairs to sit on, treating the scene like an impromptu neighborhood gathering. Others stood in clusters, discussing what they'd seen and speculating about what would happen next. Despite the tension, there was an undeniable sense of solidarity in the air. People who might never have spoken to each other before were now united by a shared desire for justice. Mrs. Alvarez patted Tanya gently on the shoulder. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. Tanya nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "I'll be fine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know what's going to happen now." Just then, Marcus approached them, his phone still recording. "Ma'am," he said to Tanya, his tone respectful but urgent, "do you mind if I post this online? People need to see what happened here tonight." Tanya hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted her pain broadcast to the world. But then she remembered the fear and helplessness she'd felt when Reynolds attacked her, and how quickly the bystanders had stepped up to support her. If sharing her story could prevent something like this from happening again, she knew it was worth it. "Go ahead," she said finally, her voice firm despite her fatigue. "Let people see the truth." Marcus nodded gratefully and turned his attention back to filming. As he zoomed in on the wrecked patrol car, Reynolds suddenly froze, his eyes darting toward the vehicle. His face went pale as a new realization hit him: the dashcam. His own camera, mounted inside the cruiser, had likely captured everything, from the initial confrontation with Tanya to the brutal kick that had sent her sprawling. With the car totaled and emergency responders on the way, retrieving the footage would only be a matter of time. For the first time since the incident began, Reynolds looked genuinely afraid. The mood on the street shifted as backup units finally arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt near the wreckage, followed by a fire truck and an ambulance. Officers spilled out of their vehicles, some heading straight for Reynolds, while others began assessing the damage to the crushed cruiser and ensuring the crowd didn't get too close. The delivery truck driver was already being questioned by one officer, his hands still shaking as he recounted how he'd lost control of his vehicle. Reynolds, still standing near the mangled remains of his car, looked visibly relieved to see his colleagues. For a moment, he seemed to regain some of his earlier confidence. He straightened his posture, adjusted his hat, and began speaking rapidly to the senior officer who approached him. "I had a situation with a civilian," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward Tanya. "She caused this whole mess, bumped into my car, and then became aggressive. I was just doing my job." But the senior officer, a calm and seasoned man named Lieutenant Harris, wasn't quick to take sides. He raised an eyebrow at Reynolds' explanation, glancing briefly at Tanya, who was now sitting on the curb with Mrs. Alvarez hovering protectively nearby. Her knees were scraped, her clothes dusty from the fall, but she held herself with quiet dignity despite her obvious pain. Around her, the crowd murmured softly, their eyes fixed on the officers. Harris turned back to Reynolds, his tone measured but firm. "We'll need to hear both sides of the story," he said, "and we'll also have to review your dashcam footage." "Standard procedure." His words hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. The color drained from his face again as he realized there was no way to spin or hide what the camera might reveal. Meanwhile, the crowd wasn't letting things go quietly. Marcus continued filming, panning his phone between the damaged cruiser, the growing number of police officers, and the people gathered around Tanya. "This is wild," he muttered under his breath, zooming in on Harris as he spoke with Reynolds. In the live stream chat, viewers were lighting up with comments. They'd better hold him accountable. That cop's karma came fast. Justice for the woman. A few bold voices in the crowd began calling out directly to the arriving officers. "Why are you protecting him?" shouted a young woman holding her toddler. "We saw everything." He attacked her for no reason. Others chimed in, their voices rising in unison. "She didn't do anything wrong. Look at her. She's hurt because of him." The sheer volume of dissent made it clear that the community wasn't going to stay silent. Lieutenant Harris raised a hand to quiet the crowd, his expression serious but not hostile. "Everyone, please," he said firmly. "We're here to investigate what happened. Let us do our jobs." His calm demeanor seemed to ease some of the tension, but it didn't stop the murmurs entirely. People exchanged knowing looks, whispering about how rare it was for law enforcement to actually listen when complaints were filed against their own. As the paramedics tended to Tanya, cleaning her scrapes and checking for any internal injuries, Mrs. Alvarez kept a watchful eye on the officers. "You tell them exactly what happened here," she urged Tanya gently. "Don't let anyone twist your words." Tanya nodded, though her heart raced at the thought of recounting the ordeal to strangers. She knew this moment mattered, not just for her sake, but for everyone else who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. When Harris approached her, notepad in hand, Tanya took a deep breath and began describing the events as clearly and honestly as she could. She recounted how she'd accidentally bumped into the cruiser, apologized immediately, and offered to pay for the damage. She described Reynolds' escalating aggression, his refusal to accept her apology, and the violent kick that left her gasping for air. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but she refused to look away or soften the truth. Harris listened intently, jotting down notes without interrupting. When she finished, he gave her a small nod. "Thank you for sharing your side," he said. "We'll make sure this is handled properly." Though his words were reassuring, Tanya couldn't help but feel skeptical. Promises like these had been made before, only for nothing to change. Still, something about Harris' demeanor gave her a sliver of hope. Back near the wrecked cruiser, another officer was carefully retrieving the dashcam footage. Reynolds hovered anxiously nearby, trying to justify his actions to anyone who would listen. "It's all a misunderstanding," he insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. But no one seemed convinced. Not the officers, not the crowd, and certainly not the thousands of people watching Marcus' live stream, which had now gone viral. By the time the dashcam footage was retrieved, the entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. Lieutenant Harris and another officer huddled near the remains of the patrol car, carefully examining the small device that held the truth. The crowd had grown even larger, spilling onto nearby sidewalks as people craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. Whispers rippled through the group like waves. Everyone knew the video would either confirm Tanya's account or cast doubt on it. For once, though, no one doubted that justice might finally prevail. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his phone still streaming live. His feed now had tens of thousands of viewers, many of whom were sharing the video across social media platforms. Comment sections exploded with reactions. Finally, proof. If this doesn't lead to action, I don't know what will. Let's hope they do the right thing. It wasn't just locals watching anymore. People from all over the country were tuning in, eager to see how the story unfolded. Marcus felt a strange mix of pride and responsibility. He had captured something important, something bigger than himself. When Lieutenant Harris finished reviewing the footage, his expression hardened. He turned to Reynolds, who immediately stiffened, sensing that the tide was turning against him. "Officer Reynolds," Harris said firmly, "you need to come with me. We're going downtown to discuss this further." Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, but Harris cut him off with a sharp look. "This isn't up for debate." Reynolds reluctantly followed Harris to one of the patrol cars, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As he passed through the crowd, murmurs erupted around him. Some people booed softly, while others simply stared, their faces unreadable masks of disappointment and anger. One elderly man muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's what happens when you abuse your power." Reynolds avoided eye contact, climbing into the car without saying a word. With Reynolds out of sight, the focus shifted back to Tanya. Paramedics had finished treating her minor injuries, but her pain was far from gone. She sat quietly on the curb, clutching a blanket someone had offered her, her eyes distant as she replayed the events in her mind. Mrs. Alvarez stayed by her side, offering words of encouragement. "You did good, sweetheart," she said softly. "You stood your ground, and now the world knows the truth." Word spread quickly about the dashcam footage. Within hours, Marcus uploaded the full video online, making sure to include timestamps and context so there could be no room for misinterpretation. The clip showed everything: the initial bump, Tanya's sincere apology, Reynolds' escalating aggression, and the brutal kick that left her sprawled on the ground. Viewers were horrified, outraged, and inspired all at once. Hashtags like #JusticeForTanya and #AccountabilityNow began trending nationwide, sparking conversations about systemic issues within law enforcement. The public outcry forced local authorities to act swiftly. Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation into Reynolds' conduct, not only regarding the incident with Tanya, but also past complaints filed against him. Records revealed a troubling pattern: multiple accusations of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse, most of which had gone unaddressed due to lack of evidence. This time, however, there was undeniable proof, and the pressure from both the community and national attention made it impossible to ignore. As news outlets picked up the story, interviews poured in from neighbors, colleagues, and even former victims of Reynolds' misconduct. One woman tearfully recounted how he had wrongfully arrested her son during a traffic stop years ago, while another described being humiliated in front of her children during a routine questioning. These stories painted a damning picture of an officer who had operated above the law for far too long, and now his actions were catching up to him. Meanwhile, Tanya became an unexpected symbol of resilience. Friends, family, and strangers alike rallied around her, offering support in ways big and small. Her hospital colleagues organized a fundraiser to help cover any legal fees or medical expenses she might face, raising thousands of dollars overnight. Local activists invited her to speak at upcoming community meetings, hoping to amplify her voice and push for meaningful reform. Though Tanya hadn't asked for any of this attention, she recognized the importance of using her platform to spark change. As days turned into weeks, the case gained momentum. Reynolds was formally charged with assault, misuse of authority, and violating department protocols. The charges sent shockwaves through the city, serving as a stark reminder that accountability was possible, even for those in positions of power, while the road ahead would undoubtedly be. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day of Reynolds' trial, a sea of faces filling every available seat. News cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the front where Tanya sat alongside her attorney, a kind but determined woman named Ms. Carter. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another court case. It was a moment that could set a precedent for accountability within law enforcement. For Tanya, it was personal, a chance to confront the man who had wronged her and ensured he faced consequences for his actions. When Reynolds entered the room, escorted by 2 bailiffs, the crowd erupted into murmurs. He looked different from the last time many had seen him. Gone was the air of authority and arrogance. Instead, he shuffled toward his seat with slumped shoulders and a grim expression. His attorney, a seasoned defense lawyer known for taking controversial cases, tried to project confidence, but even he seemed uneasy as the proceedings began. The prosecution wasted no time presenting its case. They started with the dash cam footage, playing it on a large screen for everyone in the courtroom and beyond to see. As the video played, gasps echoed through the room. Even those who had already watched it online were struck anew by the raw emotion and injustice captured in those few minutes. When the footage showed Reynolds kicking Tanya while she lay defenseless on the ground, several jurors visibly flinched, and one woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Next, Tanya took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the railing, but her voice remained steady as she recounted the events of that night. She described how she'd been looking forward to going home after a long shift at the hospital, only to find herself face to face with someone who viewed her not as a person but as a stereotype. "I didn't expect kindness," she said softly, her gaze steady despite the weight of the moment. "But I also didn't expect violence." Her testimony painted a vivid picture of fear, pain, and resilience. She spoke about the humiliation of being attacked in public, the physical toll of the injuries, and the emotional scars left behind. But she also emphasized her determination to fight back, not out of revenge, but because she believed in justice. "I want people to know they have a voice," she concluded, her words echoing through the silent courtroom. No one should feel powerless when they're treated unfairly. The prosecution bolstered Tanya's account with testimonies from witnesses like Marcus, Mrs. Alvarez, and other neighbors who had seen or heard parts of the altercation. Each story added layers to the narrative, reinforcing the idea that what happened that night wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of misconduct by Reynolds. Internal affairs investigators also testified, presenting evidence of prior complaints against him, many of which had been brushed aside until now. Reynolds' defense team argued that he had acted under stress and misinterpreted Tanya's intentions. They claimed his reaction, though excessive, stemmed from a desire to maintain control during a tense situation. But their arguments fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Even the judge seemed skeptical, raising pointed questions that forced the defense to stumble over their responses. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. A wave of relief swept through the courtroom as the foreman read the decision aloud. Tanya exhaled deeply, tears streaming down her face as supporters reached out to embrace her. Outside, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered to hear the outcome. Strangers hugged each other, celebrating not just Tanya's victory, but the hope that this ruling would inspire change. Reynolds was sentenced to prison, stripped of his badge, and ordered to undergo mandatory counseling upon release. While some felt the punishment was too lenient given his history, others saw it as a step toward dismantling a system that had shielded officers like him for far too long. For Tanya, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but more importantly, it fueled her resolve to keep pushing for reform. As she left the courthouse that evening, surrounded by loved ones and well-wishers, Tanya paused for a moment to address the reporters waiting outside. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice strong despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "It's about every person who's ever been made to feel small or invisible. We deserve better, and we won't stop fighting until we get it." With those words, she turned and walked away, ready to begin the next chapter of her journey, one defined not by fear, but by hope and healing. In the weeks following the trial, Tanya's life began to settle into a new rhythm, though the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Her body healed slowly, the bruises fading but leaving faint marks that served as reminders of the night everything changed. Yet it was her spirit that truly transformed. What started as a moment of vulnerability had turned into a catalyst for strength and purpose. Tanya no longer saw herself as just a nurse or a mother. She now understood the power of her voice and the impact she could have on her community. The neighborhood, too, felt different. The incident had ignited a fire in its residents, many of whom had long felt powerless against systemic injustices. Inspired by Tanya's courage, they came together to organize peaceful protests, workshops, and town hall meetings aimed at fostering trust between the community and law enforcement. Flyers were posted on lampposts and shared online, inviting people to join conversations about accountability, transparency, and reform. For the first time in years, there was a sense of collective hope, a belief that change was possible if enough people stood united. Tanya played an active role in these efforts, often speaking at events and sharing her story with anyone willing to listen. At first, standing before crowds made her nervous. She worried about being judged or dismissed, but the overwhelming support she received gave her confidence. People clapped, cheered, and even cried as she recounted how she refused to stay silent despite the fear. Many told her afterward that her words had inspired them to speak up about their own experiences, creating a ripple effect of courage and solidarity. One of the most impactful initiatives born from the movement was a mentorship program for young people in the neighborhood. Spearheaded by Marcus and Mrs. Alvarez, the program paired teens with adult mentors who taught them leadership skills, conflict resolution, and civic engagement. "We can't wait for someone else to fix things," Marcus explained during one meeting. "If we want a better future, we have to build it ourselves." Tanya volunteered as a mentor, using her nursing background to teach health workshops while encouraging kids to dream big and stand up for what's right. Meanwhile, local authorities faced mounting pressure to implement reforms. The police department introduced mandatory bias training, stricter oversight protocols, and community liaison officers tasked with bridging gaps between residents and law enforcement. While some skeptics questioned whether these changes would stick, others remained cautiously optimistic. "It's not perfect," Tanya admitted during a panel discussion, "but it's a start." Real change takes time. As months passed, Tanya found joy in small victories: the smile of a child graduating from the mentorship program, the sight of neighbors working side by side to clean up a park, the sound of laughter echoing through streets once filled with tension. These moments reminded her why she kept fighting, not for revenge, but for healing and progress. On a quiet evening, Tanya sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching her kids play in the yard. The sun cast golden hues across the sky, painting the world in warmth. She thought back to the night of the incident, remembering the fear and helplessness she'd felt. But instead of sadness, she felt gratitude for the strangers who became allies, for the justice she helped achieve, and for the resilience she discovered within herself. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. "Check your notifications. Something big just happened." Curious, Tanya opened her social media app and scrolled through the comments. News outlets were reporting that the city council had approved funding for a permanent community center dedicated to advocacy and education, and it would be named after her, the Tanya Johnson Center for Justice and Healing. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the announcement. This wasn't just recognition of her bravery. It was proof that one person's actions could spark meaningful change. As she looked out at her children running barefoot through the grass, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. We're building a better world. For them, for everyone. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it.